You might need to tweak here and there, but really for the most part, it's really all the same whether you're growing grapes for juice or table grapes or wine grapes. So so hopefully this will give you kind of a sense of the basics at least, and then we'll kind of, as Laura said, if there are questions, we can certainly discuss those towards the end. So, so we know that nutrition is important. We always get these messages about the bottom one being by far the most important for us in the industry. So, you know, managing nutrients, you know, it's important for us, for our bodies, and it's also important for the vines in order for them to function properly and whatnot. And so instead of things like when we talk about our nutrition, we talk about things like vitamin C and vitamin B12 and riboflavin, whatever that is. These are the plant nutrients that we're that all plants, pretty much all plants need. Different amounts depending on the type of plant and the type of crop that you might be growing. But obviously the big three are carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. Without those, obviously nothing can really, no organic life exists. But so when we talk about nutrient management, we're really talking more about the stuff that comes from the soil for the most part. So nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, sulfur, calcium are the macronutrients. We call them those because the plants need more of those than the other ones. And so the micronutrients, you can see they're listed as well. So the plants need various amounts of these, and the plants will bring them in, and they also lose them during the year. And so if you all flash back to your biology classes from the past, hopefully it's a more pleasant memory than not. You know, this is a basic representation of kind of the nutrient cycling. And so the point of this is not that you understand every single interaction, but the more salient point, the reason I put this up here, is to say that the majority of the nutrient uptake that our vines do is not because of chemical fertilizers, which is just one element here, as you can see. There's a whole system of nutrient cycling that goes on within the environment that the plants are taking part in. And so actually the majority of nutrients that the vines get come from these natural processes. When we talk about fertilization, we're just trying to fill in any gaps that might be there because of something that's not being fulfilled by that natural cycling process. So I think this is important to remember that the more we can do to let the natural cycle provide the nutrients for the vines, the better off we are. And that when we use fertilizers, we're just trying to fill in any gaps that environment just can't do for whatever reason. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get into this. So this chart is something that I think is always just kind of interesting. And if you look at this, it's basically a chart of looking at how many nutrients, how many pounds of nutrients are taken out in a ton of grapes. So the rectangle's around the kind of 1 ton per acre number. And so you can see the numbers, if you look at different people who have analyzed this in the past, the numbers kind of can fluctuate, but the basic pattern is the same. We tend to think about nitrogen as by far the most important plant nutrient, and it's a very important one, obviously. But when you look at the crop in grapes, we're actually pulling more potassium, that's that K, we're actually pulling more potassium out of the vineyard than we are nitrogen in the fruit. When you look at leaves and maybe cane prunings that you're pulling out when you're pruning in the wintertime, those tend to have more nitrogen than potassium. But when we're talking about the crop itself, the thing that's getting removed from the vineyard and brought into either a winery or to a farm stand or the grocery store as fresh fruit, we're actually taking more potassium out of the vineyard than anything else. And so one of the things that we talk to growers about a lot is not only is fertilizer is not just nitrogen, it's a whole host of things, but potassium is just as important, if not more important, in grape production systems as nitrogen is. So we're going to kind of trying to drink from a fire hose a little bit, but we're going to talk about some of the nutrients of concern. These are the ones that we tend to see more issues with and that we want to be a little bit more concerned about, especially in Eastern viticulture. So we won't talk about all 16 of them because we don't have time. Why the vines need them a little bit. What are some of the sources that come from? Again, a little bit of that cycling and what can we fill in. And then a little bit at the end on the factors that influence nutrient availability, some of those environmental factors, site factors that you may or may not have control over as a grower. So we'll start with nitrogen, just the one everybody thinks about. Obviously nitrogen, if you grow any kind of plants at all, if you've grown, whether it's grapes or any kind of other crop, nitrogen is obviously a very important part of plant growth and development. It's an important part of amino acids and proteins, which have all sorts of functions throughout the vine. It's an important part of the chlorophyll molecule. And certainly as far as for grapes goes, anthocyanins, which are the color compounds that, especially for red and black grapes, are very important. They're an important part of those anthocyanin compounds. And for winemaking, at least, they're also involved in providing nutrients for yeast. So, and we'll talk a little bit about how we measure this towards the end, but nitrogen, when we look at how much they need, we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 2% basically of the plant dry matter, of leaf dry matter, it needs to be nitrogen. I'll have a table towards the end of this that shows a little bit more about what the kind of critical ranges are for these different nutrients. One of the things that we run into very often, especially in Eastern viticulture, is that we often have problems with having too much nitrogen in the system rather than not enough. We talk to people who have grown grapes for a number of years here in New York or elsewhere in the East, and if they've grown grapes for more than 20, 30 years, the common practice was to put on a lot of nitrogen. Anywhere from 100 pounds of N was not unusual at all. And we've come to realize that we don't need nearly that much nitrogen on most of our soils. We actually have probably more than we actually need being generated by the soils themselves in a lot of cases. So nitrogen fertilization is something that's been cut back a lot in New York vineyards lately. So where does that nitrogen come from? Most of it, 80% of it roughly, doesn't come from anything that we add. The vines store nitrogen in the trunk and the roots, and they mobilize that, especially early in the season for spring growth and before bloom. And as the roots are starting to push out into the soil, the new roots that will do the nutrient uptake. So the vine relies on those reserves that it packed away from a previous year. The other main source of nitrogen actually comes from the soil itself. There are microbes in the soil that are breaking down organic matter, the leaves and canes that you put down, any cover crops that have died, all sorts of stuff that's in the soil there. And for every % of organic matter that you have in the soil, anywhere from 15 to 20 pounds of nitrogen is supplied to the vines. There are things that can influence that, obviously, but and that organic matter N is a major source of nitrogen in that bloom to veraison period, kind of the middle of the season where the demand is the highest. So again, filling in the gaps, we might need to apply fertilizers if those two sources don't provide enough N for the vine. And so there are different ways you can supply that. These are some synthetic options, urea and ammonium nitrate, but also there are obviously organic sources as well. This is just a quick graph showing kind of when the vines need nitrogen. So there are two main periods of uptake, right about the 2 to 3 weeks before bloom. That zero mark there would be considered the date of bloom. And so there's an initial need for nitrogen there, but the really big need comes once the vine has set the fruit and it really starts to push out a lot more leaf area, continue to grow shoots and leaves, but also trying to grow the berries as well. So there's a whole lot of demand for nitrogen. And so when we talk about recommendations for timing, we're really trying to hit that, especially that second large period of uptake when we need to supply nitrogen to the vine. So if the natural system and the vine stores can't supply it, that's when we really want to try to make sure that there's some nitrogen fertilizer that's put down that's available to the roots. Here are just a few examples of some, again, these are synthetic, non-organic materials that get used a lot. Ammonium nitrate, urea. Urea breaks down into ammonium nitrate essentially, and so those two you can almost kind of consider the same thing. They act the same way. different forms of nitrate and ammonium. Those nitrate and ammonium are the two forms of nitrogen that are primarily taken in by the vine. So we try to supply those in this. Making a decision between what source of nitrogen to use, more often than not, we'll tell people just use the one that gives you the best bang for your buck. The lowest price per pound of N that you can get, because they all work very similar. But like I said, they all kind of break down to nitrate and ammonium in the end. And so whatever you might need, if there's possible need for potassium nitrate might be an option. Potassium nitrate also works well through a drip system if you're going to apply that. So that might be an option for that. So again, it just comes down to mostly an economics question more than a material question itself. So moving into our next big one, potassium. Again, saying, we're talking about that managing potassium is probably as important, if not more important, in vineyards than as nitrogen. Potassium has a whole lot of different roles in the vine. It's obviously a component of a number of different compounds that are involved in all sorts of different regulation of different pathways in the vine. A couple of its big jobs are helping to balance charges across cells as things are moving back and forth between vessels and different cells. So from veraison to harvest, when sugars are getting pumped into the berry, potassium helps to help those sugars move into the berry. And it's also really important. It's the thing that helps the stomata, those little cells that open and close, the openings on the underside of leaves that control how much water the vine is respiring. Potassium is the element that opens and closes those stomata. And so if you have a very deficient vine in potassium, it has a really hard time regulating water use. And so that can be a serious consequence of potassium deficiency. So you saw when we talk about nutrient levels, looking at somewhere between 1% and 2% of potassium in a petiole sample again, 150, 200 pounds in a soil sample. Again, I'll summarize this at the end of the slide. One of the things that we found, there are 2 times where we can take nutrient tests of the plants themselves. One time is at bloom, and the other time is at veraison, that time when the berries start to change color. And what's so special about those times, they're easy for growers to spot and to manage and to do something at. And so we have standards based on taking samples at those 2 times of the year. And when it comes to potassium, we've actually found that taking a petiole sample at veraison at that later point in the season actually is probably a little bit better of an indicator of the vine status than the bloom sample. And it has to do with some ways that the vine uses potassium between bloom and veraison and things like that. But we generally recommend, if you're looking at potassium in your nutrient samples, that taking a sample at that late summer time is a better time. And these 2 pictures here are basically examples of what pretty serious potassium deficiency looks like, especially the one on the right. This is a vineyard here in the Finger Lakes several years ago that was really having problems getting potassium to its vines. And this picture was taken in early September, I believe. So you can see the vine has started to lose leaves, and a lot of them aren't green. So serious potassium deficiency can be a problem. When can that happen? And these can be not just potassium. These tend to be times where we have more problems with nutrients in general. When it's a dry year, we need water in the soil to help nutrients move towards the roots and for the roots to do their work. And so if the soil is very dry, like it was out here last year, especially in the Finger Lakes, we saw some nutrient deficiencies in areas where we normally wouldn't see it. It's not that the nutrients weren't there. It's just the water wasn't in the soil for the vines to pick it up. If you have a heavy crop load, if you remember back to that table that I showed you earlier, if you have a heavy crop load, if you have 8 tons per acre, 10 tons per acre hanging on a vine, you have more potassium that's got to be devoted to helping that crop get ripe. And so we can often see potassium deficiencies following a very large crop load, or in the forming during a year where you have a very heavy crop load, a big load of grapes on the vines. Excuse me. Areas where topsoil has been removed, potassium tends to be a little bit higher in topsoils, and so areas where land leveling has been done or things like that. Areas where there's poor weed management, so there's basically just competition for uptake of those nutrients. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. If you apply dolomitic limestone, so that means limestone that has a higher content of magnesium in it, we tend to see more potential for potassium deficiency forming for that, and I'll explain that in a minute. But it basically has to do with the relationship between potassium and magnesium. So again, just a list of some of the materials that are available for potassium fertilization if you do need to supplement. By far the most common one to use is potassium chloride, or a lot of people will call it potash. It's fairly inexpensive given the amount of potassium that it supplies, and so it has a fairly high percentage too. So it's by far the most common type, but obviously there are other sources. We said before that there's a whole lot of potassium that goes into the fruit at harvest time. Some of that stays in the skins, and so you can actually supply some potassium back into the vineyard when you spread your pumice back out in the field. If you're pressing grapes for wine, if you're doing it for table grapes, obviously that's not going to be an issue. But just a way of saying that there are some of the organic sources that are there as well for potassium, but they tend to be very low percentage compared to synthetic sources. All right, magnesium. Probably more than anything else, it's certainly involved in a whole lot of different enzymes and again in protein synthesis, connecting different amino acid chains. But by far, probably the most important thing is that it's the central atom in the chlorophyll molecule. Without that magnesium atom, it can't hold all the rest of that structure together. So when we talk about vines that are deficient in magnesium, we're talking about vines that start to turn yellow. And we'll see that here in a second. How much mag do you need? About 0.5%. So this is kind of a smaller number compared to some of the other ones we've seen so far. Maybe 1/2 to 1/4 by percentage of the tissues. Recommended soil amounts, generally 250 to 500 pounds per acre. If you get your soil reports in parts per million, which some labs do, you basically divide that number in half. So 125 to 250 parts per million in soils. As I said, because magnesium is that central atom in that chlorophyll molecule, when we're deficient in it, we see yellowing in the vines, particularly between the veins. And you can see that in the picture there. On some red-fruited varieties, it'll actually show up red instead of yellow. Depends on how much of the anthocyanin, those red pigments, are in the vine. That deficiency symptom will generally show up in the basal leaves first, because if the vine is deficient, those leaves down towards the bottom of the shoot will transport some of the magnesium up to the younger leaves. So this is one of the things we talk about a lot with magnesium. This is why I was mentioning we might see potassium deficiency sometimes when we're using a high amount of limestone that has magnesium in it. And that's because there's a kind of a competition going on between potassium and magnesium and calcium to some extent for uptake by the roots. And it has to do with basically how all three of those have similar channels to come into the roots, and basically are competing for places on the particles in the soil to be held. And so if we flood the soil with a whole lot of magnesium or a whole lot of calcium, that means there's less places on the soil particles for potassium to be held, and it can be let out of the soil and make it less available to the vines. And so this graph here basically kind of shows the relationship between vines that have various amounts of petiole potassium in the petioles. That's the vertical axis. And then the horizontal axis is how much magnesium is in the petioles. You can see there's a pretty serious relationship between the two. If you have high potassium in the petioles, you'll have low magnesium. If you have high magnesium, you'll have low potassium. So that dot there that's in there, that's kind of the target number we have for vines that tend to have higher crops. So this was developed using Concord vines. But if we're talking about table grapes or wine grapes that tend to have smaller crop loads, we still like to see our petiole numbers somewhere between that, 1 and a little over 1 up to 2, because that still keeps us in this range where we have reasonable magnesium numbers. If you go much above 2, you really start to drop off of magnesium there. So this is just a way of kind of saying these two are in balance. And so when we're looking at managing those, you need to keep that balance in mind. Again, probably the main source of magnesium in a lot of soils is when people put lime down if they need to. Otherwise, there's things like magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salts essentially. Magnesium is that's one of the primary sources of magnesium if you don't use limestone. Relatively cheap, but again, you can see it doesn't have a whole lot of magnesium in it. Phosphorus is something that we actually don't worry quite as much about in grapevines as we do probably in other crops. Obviously, it's important in metabolic processes. ATP is the primary energy molecule in plants, and so it's obviously an important part of that. Also part of cell membrane compounds, the phospholipids that make up the cell walls of membranes. Deficiency symptoms can sometimes look a little bit similar to what we had talked about with magnesium. And when we talk about phosphorus really is, we tend not to see a whole lot of phosphorus deficiency in vineyards in the East when our soil pH is in the right place. Phosphorus complexes with other ions at different pHs. And so if the pH is low, like below about 5.5, it creates some complexes with aluminum and iron and becomes unavailable to the vine. If we get that pH higher, then phosphorus becomes more available. So more often than not, when I'm talking to growers, the only time I'll suggest adding phosphorus fertilizer is before you even plant the vineyard. Because once you put the vineyard in, it's hard to get phosphorus down to the root zone. It doesn't move through the soil very easily. But also, just getting your pH in the right spot will help to make phosphorus available to the vines. So like I said, it's not mobile in soils at all. And so getting it down to the root zone takes a very long time if you're just relying on rainfall to move it through. And adjusting the pH is probably the best way to ensure that phosphorus remains available to the vine. And actually, we probably see more of a response of the cover crop that's in between the rows of vines than we see from the vines themselves when we have good phosphorus amounts in the soil. Which is not a bad thing given how much rain we get during the growing season. And having that cover crop between the rows is helpful for alleviating compaction and things like that when we're driving over it. So again, a couple of examples of materials for phosphorus. Similar to nitrogen, basically the forms are very similar for synthetic ones and how they work. Basically get the one that the cheapest for the amount of phosphorus that you can get. Again, you can get organic sources from manure and compost and things like that. Those numbers are going to be a lot smaller than the synthetic versions. Calcium, this is another one that we don't tend to worry about too much because vines generally do pretty well with getting this, at least in our neck of the woods here in this part of the world. So I won't spend too much time on this. In apples, it can cause a real problem if you're low in potassium, this bitter pit disorder. We really don't have any evidence that we see a similar problem with fruit quality. Although there are a lot of chemical salespeople who will tell you otherwise, we just don't have any evidence that pumping up the vines with calcium does a whole lot from fruit quality standpoint or from a disease management standpoint or anything like that. We have no proof to say that it absolutely doesn't, but there's nothing that really supports that claim either. Soil levels, there's a whole range of it. There's a lot of calcium in most of our soils, so we tend not to see a problem too much. And as most of you know, lime contains a whole lot of calcium, and so that is where we tend to get more calcium as a fertilizer. If we need to add calcium, lime is one of the cheaper ways to add it. If you don't need to change the pH, something like gypsum, calcium sulfate is another option. Boron is the one micronutrient that we'll talk about because we can see some issues with boron deficiency in some years. Boron Probably primarily we talk about boron as helpful for fruit set. It helps to develop pollen and have that pollen be fertile, able to fertilize the egg that's inside the flower. Also has some regulatory roles, but primarily we talk about it from a standpoint of fertility and encouraging better fruit set. The thing we have to be careful with boron is that there's a fairly narrow window between a vine being deficient and having too much. So the picture here is what happens when we have deficient boron. You can see the fruit set can be decimated pretty quickly. Some of the deficiency symptoms, stunted growth, zigzag shoots, but again, poor fruit set tends to be the one that we look at the most. Like I said, toxicity could be we can go from deficiency to toxicity fairly easily. And so some of the symptoms like that are this marginal leaf burning you see in this picture here, picture of a vine that got too much boron as a fertilizer spray. So probably the main material that gets used a lot, there are plenty of others, but historically has been a material called Solubor. And if the vines need some, the general recommendation has been to put a couple of foliar sprays on low amounts prior to bloom so that the vine has it incorporated into the tissues before fruit set starts. And that can be applied to the vines directly onto the leaves, or you can also apply it to the soil as well. Other micronutrients, like I said, we're not going to really talk about them generally because we tend not to see too many problems of them, and mostly because the soil pH will alleviate most micronutrient problems. Where we tend to see these is primarily in soils with a very high pH, so greater than 7.5, and probably even greater than 8 is more common. Iron and zinc deficiencies are the most common that we see. But if we get our soil pH locked in the right area, we tend not to see problems with this. Some of our fungicides actually have these micronutrients as part of them, and so mancozeb has both manganese and zinc. So you actually get a little bit of both of those nutrients when you spray a mancozeb spray on the vines. If you use Bordeaux mix, which is copper and lime, you're obviously getting copper. But like I said, when we see micronutrient problems here in the East, the main recommendation and the main solution is to get our soil pH in the right area, and that will make those nutrients available. So here's just a summary slide of the petiole and soil values for some of these things that we've talked about. And we'll talk about doing those in a second. But this is just kind of the summary of where we like to see those values when we do a new plant test or a soil test. And I'm getting near the end here, Laura, so don't worry. Just real quick, couple of mentions about what are some of these influencing factors. We've already talked about soil pH, and I'll show you another slide about that. Soil pH probably has more to do with making nutrients available to the vines than anything else. If we get our soil pH in the right range for the grapes that we're growing, that will alleviate a lot of fertility problems. Not all of them necessarily, but a lot of them. Soil texture will have an impact. If you have a very sandy soil, those soils are not able to hold a lot of nutrients. And so you might have to kind of feed small amounts to the vine multiple times over the years. If you have a very heavy clay soil, that can impact root functioning. And so that will influence how much what nutrient uptake looks like. Soil moisture, we talked a little bit about that already. There is some evidence about rootstocks having different levels of uptake, but most of that work is done in places that are more arid than the East. When we have enough rainfall, we tend to get enough, we don't see a whole lot of difference between rootstocks with nutrient uptake. This is just a chart that shows the relative nutrient availability of different nutrients at different pHs. So down along the bottom, you can see pHs running from 4, extremely acidic, up to 10. And you can see just for each of the nutrients, kind of as that white bar gets wider, that means it's more available at that pH. So you can see if we're down, a pH of 5 or less, a lot of the macronutrients we talked about, nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, are less available. But things like iron, manganese, boron, the micronutrients, are more available. So if you go up towards the other end into that 8 to 8.5 to 9 range, which we tend not to have too many soils like that in this area, but there are some pockets, that's when we start to see problems with micronutrient availability. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to just go past this really quick. Basically saying, if we have a very low pH, aluminum is an ion that is much more available. There's a whole lot of aluminum in our soils. And if the soil pH is low enough, if they have a very low lime soil, there'll be more aluminum that's available to the vines for uptake, even though it's not a nutrient. Aluminum is toxic to plant roots. And so if we can get our soil pH kind of above 5 to 5.5, that aluminum availability and that aluminum impact on vine growth is greatly reduced. So again, it's an argument for getting our soil pH in the right spot. Doing that is really hard because lime does not move through the soil very easily. So basically the best time to alleviate soil pH problems and nutrient problems is before you even put the vines in the ground. Lime, like I said, is very slow acting in the soil. If you put something on the surface, you might be able to change the soil pH in that top 6 inches or so in a lot of times. But where most of the roots are, especially in a more mature vineyard, you're not getting that much change of the soil pH. So doing that early work before you put the vineyard in is by far the best thing you can do. So you're gonna have to do some deep plowing. You're gonna have to get, maybe not something quite this big. That blade is about a 4-foot blade. So you may not have to go quite that deep, but you're gonna have to try to get something down 18 inches to 2 feet if you can, down towards that root zone, because that's the best time to do that. So lime and phosphorus are probably the two most important ones to do pre-plant because, again, of their inability to move through the soil profile. For table grapes and most grapes that we grow, this is kind of the sweet spot for soil pH. Because a lot of the things that we do, whether it's rain or adding other fertilizers and things like that, our soils tend to get a little bit more acidic as they go. So we try to overshoot the pH a little bit when we first plant or before we plant. And so we like to have pH somewhere in the low 6s to mid 6s is kind of the ideal spot for most grape varieties when we're putting in new vineyards. Just to reiterate, soil texture can play a major part in it. The amount of clay really has a large amount of influence on how much nutrient availability there is to the vines. And because they are negatively charged, there's a whole lot of surface area to their volume. If you took a soil science class, you learned all about this. But so like I said, if there's a lot of sand, those soils don't tend to be able to hold nutrients as well. And again, soil water content. If you have dry soils, nutrients can't really get to the roots and get picked up. If you have wet soils, the roots can't respire. They need oxygen just like we do. And so if you go underwater and your roots go underwater, you can't respire. And that's what creates the energy we need to take in nutrients that the plant needs to take up nutrients. And so wet soils, you also just get a reduction of root growth in general. So you just have a smaller net to pick up the nutrients there. So to extremes, obviously, but then this is just two examples of soil water content, what that does to vines, including nutrient availability. So just last slide, Laura, I promise. We talked about looking at soil sampling and tissue sampling to get a sense of what the nutrient status is in your vineyard. We have a couple of videos on YouTube that we've put together on how to do soil tests and pedial tests. So I would recommend you take a look at those. But also Laura's team and any extension office can also give you some help with getting the materials to do that, how to submit those samples, how to collect those samples. They can certainly do that for you as well. So with that, I know I've kind of gone over a little bit, but with that, if there are any quick questions, I'd sure be happy to answer them, or I can answer later if you'd like.
Hans, thank you very much. That was great. You guys probably understand that we're asking these speakers to condense an entire course worth of information into 30 minutes as just a way to give you an idea of the things that you should be concerned about. And I appreciate that effort because that was great. I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. And so, Hans, are you going to be able to stay logged on until the end?
I will. I'll try to. If nothing else, I'll tune back in towards the end.
Okay, that sounds great.
And see if there are any questions there. But I'll stick around for a little bit, at least right now, but
Okay,
let's tune in,
perfect.
yeah.
Thank you. And if you guys, if we do, you know, if you think of questions and you want to email me, I'll make sure that we get answers for you even after the end of the webinar series. But right now would be really convenient if you have a question. Our next speaker is a team member from Eastern New York, Anna Wallace. Anna works with tree fruit growers, apple growers in the Champlain Valley, and she also works with the Champlain and Upper Hudson grape industry, the folks that are making wine in that area. And she's going to talk today about grape pests and IPM practices. And Anna, looks like your presentation is up, so thank you.
Yeah, so you can see that okay, Laura? And can you hear me okay?
I can see and hear you beautifully.
All right, terrific. So like Laura was just saying, I'm going to try and give you a really brief overview of pest management. It's a whole course worth of information that I'm going to try and give you some insights into in just this half an hour. I'm going to talk about a few of the great pests that you're going to encounter, and then some IPM or integrated pest management practices that you might use to effectively manage them. So we've talked a lot about effective site selection. Hans just talked in depth about nutrient management, all kinds of practices that you're going to consider to produce really healthy, beautiful looking fruit. So the last thing that we want to happen is to see something like this. And there are so many pests that you're going to encounter that can have the potential to devastate both the foliage and the fruit of your vines overnight or in very short windows of time. So let's see if I can find my chat box. Does anybody recognize either of these pests? If you want to try and type in, do you recognize the one on the left? No guesses? Okay, well, yep, really good. So a couple people got it, Japanese beetle, and that's a pretty popular, even just garden variety pest, not unique to grapevines. And then how about the one on the right? Anybody recognize that? Any guesses? Very good, Laura. Laura got it. So this is black rot, and we're going to talk in depth about both of these a little bit later. But I think you can see how catastrophic the damage can be, and both of these pests cause damage in a really short window of time. So what I'm going to try and do is give you a quick overview of a management approach you might take and how you might use integrated pest management, and then go through some groups of pests, sort of from macro to micro, some wildlife, then insects, diseases, and viruses. Give you some biology of these pests, the damage they can cause, and then some management strategies. And at the end, I'd like to give you a bunch of resources that you can use to implement management strategies in your specific vineyard site. So can I ask you guys, does anyone know what IPM is? Do you understand that concept? And how many of you are using that currently, either in your vineyard or on your operation? So can you just raise your hand if you know what IPM is and are using it?
We didn't really go over the raising hand too much.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my fault. We weren't totally integrated, but looks like people are chatting it in there.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing that in the chat window. So that's just as good. I'm just curious if you guys have any background in it. And it looks like a bunch of you do. So this will be a great little overview for you, or review. I like this definition from the National Coalition on IPM, that IPM is a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools so that you're minimizing economic, health, and environmental risks. So I want you to notice the words that I've highlighted in different colors here. We're not eradicating pests, but we're managing them at an economically viable level. And we're doing that by combining all the available tactics, not just pesticides. We're also using cultural and physical tools and tactics to control these pests. And when we're talking about sustainability, the first thing that usually comes to mind is environmental sustainability, but we also want to make sure that our approach is considering human health and making sure this is a viable business. So we're talking about economic sustainability as well. The definition below I really like from Galen Dively. He's a well-known entomologist at the University of Maryland that studies IPM. And he says that IPM is a philosophy of pest control founded on the principles of ecology. So what he means to say here is that we're considering the vineyard site as an ecosystem, so as an agro-ecosystem, where there are multiple organisms all contributing to sort of one unit. And so we have to consider all of the different inputs and all of the different organisms and how they're interacting. So this diagram on the right, you can see a really nice visual of how we're overlapping cultural, biological, chemical controls to consider all of these things that we want to maintain sustainably. Okay, so now I'm going to try and give you a really brief overview of some of these different categories of pests. And I'm going to try and provide you with a different range of management options and sort of the biology or behaviors of the pests so that you might implement an IPM strategy. So starting with only wildlife, actually, I cut out weeds just in the sake of time. So we'll talk about birds, deer, and rodents. So birds can be a huge pest for vineyards. I've seen a number of vineyards this year that lost their entire crop virtually overnight. And so birds, we're talking about anything from songbirds and crows to turkeys can also be a really big problem. And as soon as the berries start to change color, that's veraison. Jim talked about the different the different phenological stages of grapevines. When those berries start to change color, that indicates to birds and other pests that the fruit is ripe, ready to eat. And so that's the time that birds are going to be moving into your crop. They can also cause damage to crop where other pests might move in, but the main concern here is that they're going to eat the fruit. So the best method of control that you can provide is really a physical barrier between the fruit and the birds. So the bottom right picture there, you can see Richard Lemoy, a guy that I work really closely with, is applying bird netting to his orchard that is going to actually cover the entire canopy. And it takes fairly limited time and resources to be able to pull this off. You can see this bar that he's got attached to his tractor, and you can do that on foot to hold the net up over your canopy while a couple people are stretching the sides of the grape netting, the bird netting down over either side of the canopy. And for our half-acre research vineyard, it only takes a couple hours with 3 or 4 people to do the whole thing. Even before that, I sort of skipped over site selection, but when you're picking a vineyard site, if you have the option to choose a site that is not in a migratory pathway, that would help you minimize the amount of birds you're going to see in the first place. You can also pick a site that is away from bird habitats, so maybe farther away from wood edges where birds are going to roost and things like that. Lethal control is really not an option for most of the birds that are going to be pests here. Although a lot of farmers like to use lethal control for a lot of pests, some of these birds are protected, so we don't recommend that. A couple other deterrents you can use are visual scare devices like the Stancing Man or recorded distress calls of predatory birds. And these both have fairly good effect. The one concern being birds can learn that these are not dangerous things, so they modify their behavior and will learn to move back into your vineyard. So these have to be changed and moved around your vineyard and things like that to remain effective. Deer are our next major wildlife pest, and they will browse or eat all of the tender shoots in your vineyard, both on newly planted vines and any new growth that occurs on an annual basis. And again, the best way to control them is going to be by providing a physical barrier between the deer and your vineyard. And as most of you probably know, deer are able to jump really high, so the only really effective fence that you can be using is an exclusion fence that is 8 or 9 feet high tensile woven wire, which can add up to be a considerable expense. One estimate was approximately $10,000 for a 10-acre block, but that is going to depend a lot on your specific materials that you're sourcing, and you can use this cost estimate tool to sort of evaluate that for your individual site. Also on the right here, the lower picture, these grow tubes are somewhat effective for younger vines, but as soon as the vines start growing out of the top, all of this exposed new shoot is going to be a nice snack for deer. Okay, our third wildlife group is rodents, so mice and voles. And the type of damage that they can cause is this girdling of vines. So eating around the base of the trunk of your vines, which leads to vine death, or at the very least, reduced vine vigor. So rodents are really attracted to the weeds and the ground cover that are in your vineyard during the winter time underneath the snowpack. So they like to run around and feed on this foliage. And then when they prefer that as a food source. So when they run out of that material or they run into your vines, they'll continue to feed around the base of the vines and girdle your vines. So the best way to control mice or voles is to control that ground cover. So by providing weed control or mowing very low, close to the ground, especially in the fall and into the winter, when they're going to be looking for more food and more habitat, preventing them from wanting to be in your vineyard in the first place. You also can prevent or remove habitat that would encourage more rodent activity. So we typically don't recommend to use any mulches, and possibly removing habitat around your vineyard that is going to foster nesting of rodents around your vineyard. In larger scale vineyards, you can use things like baited stations to control rodents lethally. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of insect pests. There are more than this, but these are 3 that I get most questions about and can cause significant amount of either visual or detrimental damage to your crop and your vines. So Phylloxera is a disease that I get a lot, or an insect, I'm sorry, that I get a ton of questions about because it's really ugly. The insect causes these really, really ugly galls on the leaf surface. And this is actually the insect creating a protective coating to lay their eggs for the insect, one of the insect life stages to develop. And despite it being very ugly, this is mostly a cosmetic problem and not going to cause significant damage to your vines or to your fruit production, to your crop. Other life stages of this insect feed on the roots of grapevines, and this can be a really detrimental problem to vinifera varieties. And that is because this is a pest that's native to America. So any of our native varieties have co-evolved with Phylloxera and have some level of resistance. Whereas Vitis vinifera are European type grapes, so they don't have any resistance to the Phylloxera organism. So the best way to control that is to use, if you're going to be planting vinifera varieties, they can be planted on a resistant American rootstock. So here are Japanese beetles. In really vigorous plantings, these insects are also really only cosmetic, the damage that you're seeing, but they can be very, very damaging if they start to defoliate and completely skeletonize your leaves. They usually appear in mid-July, and luckily we can observe the damage and then target the adults with 1 or 2 summer sprays and pretty effectively control them. I think it's interesting to note that a rule of thumb, grapevines can sustain up to about 30% leaf area loss before they see any detrimental effect to your crop load or quality or overwintering. So this is a picture from a study that was done by researchers at Michigan State, and you can see 30% leaf area loss is pretty significant. So just because you have Japanese beetles in your vineyard doesn't mean that you need to be spraying for them. Okay, another pretty significant grape insect pest is grape berry moth. It's a much more significant pest in Western New York, where they have a more warmer growing season than in Northeastern New York, where I'm located. But what's different about this insect pest is it feeds on the clusters during bloom, and then the larvae actually enter the berries where they're protected from any insecticide sprays. So it's very important to target your sprays, insecticides, to the susceptible form of the insect, so when it's moving out of the berries and is no longer protected by the fruit. So we do this by observing models that have been developed by scientists that use the warmth accumulation that has occurred during the season to predict when the insects will be moving out of the fruit and when our insecticides will be effective. So if you only have a few infestations, you can remove them by hand. Otherwise, you can be using these predictive models, and I can give you more information on that if you find that you have high pressures in your vineyard, to be able to time your sprays effectively. Okay, so now I'm going to move into disease pests, and diseases are by far the most important pests that you're going to be managing in a vineyard. They take the most intensive management and can cause some of the worst damage. So I'm going to try and cover these 5 representative disease pests. I can't cover every disease pest again because we're limited on time. But for all of these, we have some similar characteristics. And the thing that I'd like you to really consider is that we have unique challenges that most of these fungal or disease pests are active and infect vines before we can even detect them. So different than insects, where we can observe an increasing number of insects and then apply some kind of control at a given threshold, we typically have to use preventative and protective controls before we even see the disease pests and the symptoms in the vineyard. Now, we can know from previous seasons whether we have a high pressure and a high population in the vineyard, and then tailor our approach this season accordingly. But regardless of that, even if you know you have a high or low pressure, these controls are still going to be protective and preventative. And unfortunately, in our northeastern climate, where we have really high humidity, really high moisture, which is great for growing things, it's also really great for the development of disease. So chemical control is really necessary for most of these diseases in our vineyards. So on the next few slides, what I'd like to do is give you some damage and symptom characteristics so you can maybe start to identify these diseases in your vineyard. Then I would like to talk about some of the conditions that are required for infection, sort of how they overwinter, in your vineyard and persist from season to season, and then some of the control measures that are necessary, and when the critical time is going to be for you to control them, when your vine is going to be most susceptible to an infection.
Anna, can I interrupt just for a second? We have a question about organic sprays. I'm not sure exactly which pest they're concerned about, but if you just kind of make a statement about that at some point.
Sure, yeah, and there is an organic grape pest management guide that's available. There are a couple of diseases in particular that there are not very many organic approved materials for, and in particular black rot, and I'll point that out when we get there. But that's sort of considered the Achilles heel of organic vineyards at this point.
And the one thing she's interested in primarily is Japanese beetle. It's trickier.
Sure. And yep, that one's trickier. There also aren't very many organic approved materials that are effective against Japanese beetle. There are things like kale and clay that is sort of a tactile thing. Insects don't like to walk on it. But I don't recall if that's very effective against Japanese beetle or not. My feeling is that it probably is not. So hopefully you don't have a very high Japanese beetle pressure, and you can just remove them by hand. And that would be my recommendation for organic. Okay, so the first disease I want to talk about is Phomopsis. This is a fungal disease that can infect any green tissue on your plant, and then the berries become susceptible later in the season when they develop. On the left here, you see my arrows pointing to the rachis, which is just the connective structure from the berries to the main stem. And so when you see an infection of Phomopsis, the rachis will get very brittle and the berries will drop off or get shriveled, and the leaves become really misshapen. You can see these characteristic lesions on the rachis and the stem in the top picture. And then in the bottom picture, this is the overwintering structure of Phomopsis. These little black fungal protective structures called pycnidia. And these structures protect them over the winter, and then rain early in the spring causes the spores to be released, and that is what infects the green tissue. So the best way to control this disease is actually just to remove any inoculum sources. So pruning out dead wood or diseased wood or winter damaged wood that has a lot of these pycnidia or overwintering structures is a really effective way to reduce your inoculum for the next season. Nevertheless, you're not ever going to remove 100% of your inoculum for any disease, so you'll still need to be providing some kind of chemical control. And this is one of the earliest active diseases in vineyards. So a fungicide spray is recommended very early in the season, around 1 inch shoot growth through the first few weeks of growth. And that is usually applied preventatively to protect any new green tissue, any new growth. Luckily, this disease usually only has about 1 generation per season. So you only have to make 1 or maybe 2 applications to control the disease per season. Okay, Downy mildew is the next disease I want to talk about. And this disease causes these brown lesions on the upper surface of the leaf, and then corresponding cottony spore bodies on the underside of the leaves. And this is actually where the fungus is, where the disease is growing. And this is actually not a fungal disease. It's a very closely related disease with very similar characteristics. So this disease organism overwinters on leaf debris, so also on plant material, but on the soil surface or on the ground of your vineyard. And then once again, warm nights and rain contribute to the release of spores that then are ejected into the canopy and infect new green tissue. So the conditions for infection are very specific. Wayne Wilcox, who's a Cornell pathologist, will tell you all the stars have to align to get an infection, but once they do, it can take off very quickly and cause lots and lots of generations and lots of new infections, because the generation time is only 4 or 5 days. So it's important to be watching out for these conditions and making sure any new growth is protected with a fungicide or with a pesticide preventatively before these conditions occur or very shortly after. The critical management period for this disease is approximately 2 to 3 weeks before bloom, and then on a 7 to 10 day interval of spraying. Powdery mildew is another fungal disease. It also causes fungal growth on the upper surface of the leaves, sort of a powdery fungal growth that also will cover the berries. The berries can turn really dark and shrivel and may not ripen all the way. Like the other disease organisms we've talked about, it's very temperature and moisture dependent. It prefers really high humidity and warmer conditions to produce new generations. But unlike other diseases, it does not require free water to move. So it does not actually require rain to move spores from leaf to leaf or from leaf to fruit. These spores can actually be spread by wind and by humidity. And under the control here, I should have mentioned this earlier for other diseases, but maintaining good canopy management to improve quick drying time, lower humidity is extremely effective at reducing a favorable environment for these diseases and then reducing the probability that they are going to be able to persist and then infect your vines. The critical management period for this organism is a little bit later, so about 10-inch shoot growth to bunch closure. So your berries remain more susceptible to this later in the season. Okay, the last organism I'd like to talk about is black rot. This is another fungal disease. Also causes leaf lesions on the upper surface of the leaf, these brown spots. But these lesions are surrounded by a characteristic dark margin, dark brown or purple, and you can often see fungal bodies within the lesion, little dark spots. On the right here, you can see the progression of the disease in the fruits. These numbers sort of just pointing you through the progression. The fruits start to turn brown and then start to shrivel. You can see some fungal bodies here in number 2. 3, they're even more shriveled. And finally, they become these really hard mummies that remain very firmly attached to the rachis. And these mummies are actually the primary way that the fungus overwinters for the next season. And again, early in the spring, rain and the right temperature trigger the release of spores to infect new tissue. So it follows then that the best control measure would be to remove these mummies, remove any source of inoculum in your dormant pruning. So making sure all the mummies are out when you're going through to prune your vines early in the spring before they start growing. Again, it's never 100%. You're always going to have some inoculum that you've missed. So the critical management period when you want to be applying a fungicide is about the start of bloom through about 5 to 6 weeks post-bloom. And I included this chart because I think it's really indicative of the importance of spray timing in disease management. And knowing when to apply a spray can make sure you effectively control the disease and to make sure that you're not wasting your time and wasting your money when you're applying these pesticides. So the first thing actually I'd like you to look at is that yellow circle that I've drawn around the number 3. And this is just our immediately pre-bloom spray. The other numbers are focusing on 2 and 4 weeks, either before or after bloom. And then the green bar is showing that during this spray timing, immediately pre-bloom, and then 2 and 4 weeks following bloom, you can get nearly 100% control. So you don't need to be spraying 2 and 4 weeks before bloom, but you do need to be maintaining your sprays following bloom. So understanding the biology of these pests and when they're active, when your grapevines are susceptible, is really important so that you can be applying your pesticides at the right time to provide adequate control. So just to recap a little bit, all of the diseases we talked about and most of the other diseases that you'll encounter have in common that sanitation or removal of inoculum sources will go a long way to be able to prevent too much disease. Also canopy management, which is what I'm showing in the pictures here, shoot thinning before and after, before on the left and after on the right, is going to maximize your airflow for quick drying conditions. And that's going to, again, create an environment that is unfavorable for the diseases so that there is less of a chance for them to survive and less of a chance for them to infect your vines. Just a little bit more about chemical control, some general considerations that you want to make for any of the diseases that you're targeting. First, it is very important to make sure that the materials that you're selecting are targeting the specific disease that you need to manage. All of these materials will say on the label, and there are, so this is an example of a label on the right here. So the label will specify what disease the material is targeting. Also, there are a lot of guides available that list a lot of products and their respective efficacy against a number of different diseases. So you've got to be making sure you're selecting a material that targets the disease that you're after. And then, like I said before, it's important to understand the biology of your pest, when it's active and when your vine is susceptible, so that you can effectively time your sprays. It's also important to note that different materials have different activities. So some are only effective as a protectant, which means they have to be applied before an infection takes place. Other materials can be applied post-infection and have what we call a kickback activity and can control infections once they've happened. So making sure you're selecting materials corresponding to those. Resistance management is something that I don't have time to get into, but it's important that you're not using the same materials over and over again, or it can lead to resistance of the pest to the material, and then that material will no longer be effective as a form of control. And this is really easy to do. You just have to rotate by numbers. On the right here, you can see this is Rivastop is a group 3 and group 40 product. So if you use a group 3 fungicide 1 spray, on your next spray you want to try and use a fungicide in a different group, so having a different group number. And the last really important consideration is that you've gone through all this trouble to select the correct materials, understand your pests, and get your pesticides on at the correct time. And it all will mean nothing if you don't get good coverage. So if you aren't adequately covering your foliage and fruit. So it's really important to make sure you've calibrated your equipment and that you're spraying effectively. And there are a number of videos on YouTube and other places online that will help walk you through these things. Andrew Landers is the pesticide application technology specialist at Cornell. He's about to retire, but he has some wonderful resources online that are very easy to learn from and will remain available even after he does retire. And I just want to emphasize that the label is the law. You can find a lot of resources online providing a lot of recommendations on materials to use and when to use them. But the label is what dictates what site that you can apply these materials to. And by site, I mean not only the physical vineyard, but also the host, the target crop that you're applying them to, the pests that you're targeting, and the time frame at which you're applying them. So it's really important to make sure you read a label before you apply any of these materials and make sure you're using them correctly. The fungicide or pesticide label will also tell you the personal protective equipment that you need to be wearing and everything that you need to know for applying the material. And this is just to show you one of the resources that's available, sort of the premier resource for our region. Many of you may be familiar with this already, but the New York and Pennsylvania Pest Management Guidelines for Grapes is a book that's updated on an annual basis that provides a lot of in-depth information about the current materials available and how to use them for effective pest control. And here's an example of a chart inside the book, for those of you who haven't seen it, in which you can see the chemical name of a certain material, the trade name. So there can be many trade names for an individual chemical based on the companies that are marketing them and their proprietary blend. And then the efficacy rating for each of these major diseases. And this is just a plus scale for the most effective, has the most pluses. So it's very, once you get into it, it takes a little bit of digging. These are very good reference guides for you to quickly see what materials are most effective. And then I won't go through this at all, but I'd like you to be aware that there are a number of examples of disease management programs. This is one that was developed by the University of Vermont for cold climate cultivars, which are typically American varieties. So they already have some fairly good resistance to a lot of our pests because a lot of the pests, I'll just say they already have a lot of fairly high resistance to a lot of the pests that we're combating. So this is sort of a skeletal disease management program that gives you the great phenological stage, some of the materials that you might try, and the diseases that you're targeting. Okay, I know I'm getting short on time. I just quickly want to say something about viruses. Viruses can cause a lot of harm to vineyards. They can also be latent, which means that they don't show symptoms. And this is a problem because they can be vectored or transferred to other vines in the area when you didn't even know that they were there. Some of these viruses, so these are just 3 of the most economically significant viruses. There are many more. Some of them are vectored by insects. This fan degeneration disease is vectored by dagger nematodes in the soil. The grapevine leaf roll disease is vectored by soft scales and mealybug, which feed on the phloem of the plant. But all of these are vectored by humans, which means when you're propagating grapevines, you're transferring it to the new plant. So it's really important that you start with clean plant material. This means it would be ideal for you to source plants from nurseries that have certified clean plant material. And the risk of propagating vines on your own can be very high because these viruses are latent in the plant and not exhibiting symptoms. Okay, so just to summarize, there are a number of cultural and mechanical controls that can be used to help mitigate these pests. And then specifically for our diseases, chemical control becomes very important. And because of limited time, I just wanted to give you a quick sort of toolbox of different things that you can look at and read about later of things that explain a lot on pest management. I already talked about the New York and Pennsylvania pest management guidelines for grapes. Also, the Cornell IPM fact sheets are one-page summaries of each pest and the biology and management strategies that you can be using. Dr. Wayne Wilcox and Dr. Greg Loeb on an annual basis produce these reports for grape disease and grape insect control. Oops, I mistyped that there, so I'll correct that. But these are sort of, Wayne calls it his manifesto, that talks about in-depth the management strategies that you can use and how it is related to the current year. I mentioned Andrew Landers earlier, and he has a number of really fantastic resources online. This is a quick link to get you to his information. And then I have a webinar that was recorded by Wayne and Andrew a couple years ago that you might want to watch to get a little bit more in-depth understanding of some of these disease pests. Okay, so with that, I don't know if I have time for any questions, but I just wanted to say thanks to Wayne, to Tim Martinson, who's the state viticulture specialist, and Lindsay Pasho, who also works in Cornell Extension, who helped me put some of this information together. So do I have time for any questions, Laura?
I think that we have time for just a couple. We have one question that I would like to get your input on, and maybe even Hans's if he wants to weigh in. They are wondering about SWD. My take on SWD is that it's still mainly limited to very thin skin varieties or varieties that have not been picked maybe, or that the spray just didn't go on. I know we had a little bit of an issue in the North Country this year, but I just wanted to get you to weigh in.
Sure, and I'm going to agree with you, Laura. I think from what we've been seeing, thin skin varieties may be problematic, but right now I don't think that we're totally convinced that it's a primary pest at this point, meaning that more likely berries are going to have some other kind of damage first, like maybe some kind of sunburn or other mechanical damage to the fruit, and then SWD is going to move in afterward. We did collect some SWD from a vineyard in the Champlain Valley, along with a number of other Drosophila, so just regular fruit flies.
All right, thank you very much, Anna. I appreciate it. And I think we're gonna keep moving along in essence of time. Anna, if you wouldn't mind, yeah, there we go. And so our next speaker is Nick Bozzo. He is a grower in the Hudson Valley. He owns and operates Nostrano Vineyards in Milton, New York. And I wanna thank him for taking time out of, I'm sure, a busy day to give this presentation. He's going to give us his overview of what he's been doing with grapes in the Hudson Valley. Thanks a lot.
Hi, thank you. I'm here. My name is Nicolas Bozzo, and I am the owner of Nostrano Vineyards. Can you guys hear me?
Beautifully.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm just going to do a very kind of quick overview of kind of from the start to the finished product, going from planting to how you harvest and how you market your fruit. If you are growing table grapes, you obviously have a reason to be doing it, or I would hope you kind of have figured out somewhat of a market and where you're going to be selling your fruit. That kind of turns into a very critical part of growing table grapes, making sure you have a market for them. So let me get started with my slideshow here. All the photos and the information is from our farm here. So I'm going to go to our first photo, our first slide. Just a little overview of site selection. As a farmer, you aren't always blessed with the best farmland, the most perfect soil. So what I have to say is work with what you have. Not every site is going to be perfect. You're going to have some unique characters. Ideally, you want it to be relatively flat. You want to have good drainage. You don't want to have any wet spots. And you preferably want to have your rows always facing north to south. And if you could, always keep your away from wood lines and trees, anything that can harbor pests or birds, or like we were talking about in the last PowerPoint here, pests are going to be a very big concern when growing table grapes. Also with site selection, into preparation to planting, I would always say, like it was said before, have your soils tested. Find out what your soils are consisting of, the acidicness, how basic they are. Are they wet? Are they overly dry? Always prefer to have a cover crop before you plant if you have time to not plant this year or the next year, but choose your field and kind of plant that with a cover crop of your choice. And I would always say heavily till your field before you plant. As deep as you can get your plow or your tiller into the ground, the more you dig up that soil, it's going to be much easier for planting and nutrition to kind of start getting into those plants. One of the most important factors would be your water source, not only for your long-term irrigation for the years to come, but if you have a water source that can be implemented right away onto your plants that you have just planted, that's going to help them a tremendous amount when trying to establish root systems. And especially planting in the spring, the Hudson Valley, we get very hot in the summertime. So having water readily available during those hot summer months is going to, give your plants a much greater increase in chance of surviving through those dry summer months. And I also suggest that you have all your trellising material ready, because as a grower, I prefer to plant and then immediately install our trellising, because that's going to allow us to tie up our bamboo pole, get those plants nice and straight, and kind of give us some structure to our trellising and where the plant's going to start to grow. Some of the varieties that are on our farm currently, some of the red table grape varieties that we have are Einset, which are going to be this lower picture, sorry, if you can see my cursor. Then we have Somerset, which I do not have a photo of. Canada's, which would be this photo here and this one down here. Jupiter's is this top right photo with the larger, more oval shaped berries. The Mars are over here, which is this little bit darker, almost looks kind of like a Concord, and Vanessa, which I don't have a picture up for you guys. So those are some of the red varieties that we have on our property here. Preferably, I like to give you some of the varieties that we grow. I would say if you are going to start growing your own varieties, it's kind of hard to pick and choose. A lot of them have different flavors. A lot of them have different characteristics with the skin, the textures. I guess it's going to be more for what's going to grow better in your site. I've been learning from my mistakes. I have some issues with some of my different varieties, and some I don't have issues. So in the future, I will be consistently planting other varieties that I have planted, but which are growing better to my property. So I'm going to go on to our next slide, which is going to be some of the white varieties we have growing on the property. And those are going to be our Hope. We have Marquee, Gratitude, and Interlocking. I don't know if I spelt that last one right. So don't hold me to that one. But those two photos up there are going to be our Hope and Interlocking grapes. The Interlockings are going to be on the left, and the Hope are on the right there. They're a much smaller berry, got nice flavor to them. We just recently planted Marquee and Gratitude, so I don't have any current photos of them, but they are a much larger berry, more round, but much larger kind of berry, loose, little bit looser cluster. So that's just some photos of the fruit that we have on our farm. Planting and trellising, very important. A lot of you might have some table grapes planted. I'm just going to give a quick overview of kind of how we, establish our vineyards. We like to have the plants about 6 foot apart. That allows you to have 3-foot cordons going each way, left and right. And standard row width, we use about 8 foot on some of our hillier sections of the farm. We use 9-foot width. It just allows you a little bit more room if you are navigating a tractor down a hill or on a side hill. As the vines do grow in, you're going to lose a good amount of space. You're going to notice that your spacing is going to get much narrower. So 8 foot is a very good width between your rows, and all your plants should be about 6 foot apart, and that's going to give them enough room to have their 3-foot cordons going each way. As for more planting and trellising here, I prefer to use 4 to 5 inch diameter poles. We have some vineyards where we do have metal poles, a little bit smaller wood poles. I think it was a 3 to 4 inch. 4 to 5 inch diameter seem to stand a little bit stronger, kind of hold those wires. You'll be very surprised how much weight will be pulling down on those wires and poles once the bearing, the weight of the fruit starts bearing down on those wires. Definitely using high tension wire. As of now, we are using a 2-wire system. One wire is on the top of the pole at 6 foot. Then we have a grow wire, which is also at 36 inches. Currently, our irrigation, we do have trickle irrigation on all of our fruit here. So on our newer plantings, we have installed a 3rd wire, which is about 12 inches to 24 inches, whatever you prefer, whatever's easy for you to step over or under, because that's going to be an issue with that wire. I prefer to keep any of your irrigation, any of your water away from where your fruit is growing, anywhere where your leaves are growing, because that's going to cause a decent amount of an issue when you talk about powdery mildew and having those humid days where the leaves aren't drying off. So I like to keep the water as low to the ground as possible. I like to keep it off the ground so you don't hit it with the mower or any other people walking over it. So it's nice to have that on a wire. Train. Once you start planting, you have your blue X. Like I said in the beginning of the presentation, I like to get all your trellising set up so you can attach your bamboo pole and your blue X to that first wire at 36 inches. That's going to allow the plant to grow through that blue X and start growing a very nice straight shoot. Here we've experimented with growing our shoot as we're training our plants from when they're just planted to the first wire. I found out over the years it's much better to kind of get that shoot growing straight up to your 6 foot wire. That's going to create a very nice trunk, a very strong, solid trunk with a nice support. So as you grow your shoot up, you want to bring it to your 6 foot wire, and then at that point, you can start bringing your shoot to the left, your other shoot to the right, and then the same on your 36 inch wire, bringing a shoot to the right or the left, and that is your typical double arm Niffin system. It's just nice to get that shoot nice and straight, because once the fruit starts, a couple years later, you're going to start bearing fruit on that plant. You're going to notice a lot of weight, and you're going to see a lot of bend. I've noticed with growing that shoot right to the top, you're almost forming almost like a nice trunk, almost like an apple tree, I compare it to, where all the weight is kind of nice and straight and bearing down on the trunk and into the roots. So it's definitely going to hold a lot more weight and support the plant. It's a little bit better than it would if it kind of was first attached to the bottom wire and then you grow to the second wire. So it's always preferred to grow to that top wire first. Weed control and pesticides, I didn't really write anything too much about that because I know I don't have a little bit of a time slot here. So I just said, see your Cornell recommends, and we had some presenters earlier that did a great job with that. So I'm going to move on. What's your bird pressure? As I began growing table grapes, I started out, I didn't have so much bird pressure at first. I was kind of surprised. But as the years went on, we planted more fruit. Birds tend to find their way to our farm. So as we started, the bird pressure wasn't so unmanageable, where reflective tape, the fake owls, that propane cannon that you might hear going off every 5 to 6 minutes. Any method I could think of, I tried. Eventually got to the point in the last few years where if we didn't invest in nets, my profit margin, it really didn't pay off. So we really had to invest in nets. So we currently have about, I want to say, 3 acres covered in nets. 2.5 of those would be table grapes. Another ½ acre would be for wine grapes. At this point in my investment, and as we kind of continue to grow table grapes, I see no future in growing table grapes unless you have your nets. We kind of came up with some figures. Birds were either eating or damaging about 50% of the crop. And now when you're overcropping, you know, maybe a vineyard, that isn't such a big problem. But when you're really trying to get your fruit to have a good quality and you're really doing some selective fruit thinning and only having a certain amount of clusters on each plant, birds that are going to start damaging your clusters, it's just going to really cut into your profit margin. The investment of nets is going to be a costly investment for most of you, depending on how many acres you have. If you have a half acre, an acre, 10 acres. But I really believe it's one of the main factors in growing table grapes is to make sure you have all your fruit netted securely, especially during the season once the veraison starts to happen. As soon as veraison starts to happen, birds are going to start pecking. They might just start pecking top few berries, but that's just going to introduce some other funguses. You're going to get a lot of insects, bees, ants that are going to come up into the plant and do some damage to the plant as well. So I highly suggest, if considering growing table grapes, to invest in nets within the first maybe 3 to 5 years. Irrigation, I believe, is a must. We really can't rely on the weather in the Hudson Valley here, considering it's been getting a little crazy with the hot, dry summers, the wet springs, and back and forth. Really no consistency here in the last couple of years. So we have all our table grapes and most of our wine grapes on trickle irrigation. Grapes do prefer to have their feet nice and dry, but in order to get sizable fruit and good bricks and good color, I believe a permanent irrigation system is definitely one of your biggest factors. Being able to regulate your water, how much water is going on per plant per day, being able to regulate it when you have a very hot week or hot month, and being able to provide water to that plant, allowing the soil to be moist, allowing the nutrients in that soil to disperse and go into the roots. I also rely on water during the fall, early fall, late summer, when we're trying to get a little bit more size out of your berries. Some of our varieties take the water a lot, better. Like our Jupiters, for example, as we are seeing them get a little bit color, we start pumping them with some water, and we really get really nice size out of that fruit. So I suggest having water readily available when you need it really makes a very big difference when growing table grapes. Onto a little bit of shoot thinning and fruit selection. Overcropping of table grapevines, it can really affect the health of the plant. It can affect the quality, and it can cause you some really big problems in the future. So in the early spring, when we start to prune, we kind of really get very selective of what buds are left. If you see in the picture here on the right side here, that is an einset plant where we kind of just regenerated a new cane. It's probably a year old here, so we took maybe our 2 or 3 year old one off, and we selected some buds here. Being able to select buds early on in the season is going to help you out when you're kind of getting into controlling how much fruit is on your plant. And as your fruit begins to set, you'll notice in some of our varieties like Somerset, Candidus, and Einset, if the winter was a very moderate winter, you're going to have an abundance of fruit. Over the last 6 years, I've noticed that if the winter was moderate, those certain varieties tend to really set fruit very heavily. At first, it looks like a good thing, but when it really starts to develop and set, you really have way too much fruit on the plant. The plant really cannot sustain that much fruit. You're not going to get good color. You're not going to get good sugars. So I always suggest making sure you're going to cut a good amount of that fruit off, whether that's early season before the fruit has set, through some shoot thinning and pruning. That's going to help with having a good, consistent quality of fruit throughout the vineyard. It's going to allow your clusters to mature rather than the clusters being overly cropped, where you're not going to be able to get all your clusters to mature and be at a, to have the flavor, because these are table grapes you're talking about. You want them to have good color. You want them to have good flavor, because you are selling them for fresh market, most of you. So it's almost making sure each single cluster is going to be perfect for you to sell and make a profit on. Let's talk a little bit about harvest. We harvest several different ways. A lot of the time we harvest in these smaller trays here. They're not quite like what you would see harvesting for wine grapes. They're much thinner. I don't like to pile too many clusters on each other, especially when you're putting them in cold storage, is what we do. As we harvest, some of our fruit does go out immediately before into cold storage. But as the fruit is ripening, and you'll notice with table grapes, you're not going to pick your whole entire vineyard in one day. You would like to be able to pick every few days and kind of stretch your season out a little bit. It'll allow you to have a better market and kind of have more of a consistent base to sell off of. So we do tend to pick in these crates here, which are narrow, and we put them in our cold storage, and they tend to stay, and you can sell. We usually sell for up to a few months during the season. Some of them we pick and go right to market, and they go in either quarts, wood ones, or your biodegradable, the green ones that you normally see. Sometimes we pick right in them in the field, makes it easier, kind of cuts down on cost of bringing them back to the warehouse where we are, cold storage, and then repacking, like you see in the picture on the right here, which is in a 2-pound clamshell. These are packed, and they are hand washed, and they are weighed and packed in a 2-pound clamshell, which we sell in a 6 clamshell flat. And those go out to grocery stores, different CSAs in the area. But that kind of is bringing your cost up a lot more, from picking to storage to washing to your label and your packaging. But that is one of our largest markets, is packed in this 2-pound clamshell right here. Another way we do sell, we do our markets, and you can see us out there at the market now, the way they're packed. So I like to say, as table grape, I kind of treat it more as an apple. It's not a juice grape, it's not a wine grape, so it's really about your looks. So when it comes to growing table grapes, you have to consider the fruit has to look good in order to sell it. It can't be just any juice grape or a wine grape. It can't have birds having their beaks pecking and having bugs. So they have to have a visual presence when growing table grapes. And that all comes with the way you are growing them. And also goes back into the last presentations, your fertilizers, your pesticides, your fungicides, and making sure the fruit really has a quality to it where it appeals to your market and is visually appealing. So you see in the middle photo here is kind of just a loose picked Einset, which is a very nice, very flavorful berry. It's got a little bit of strawberry kind of flavors to it. And then you can kind of see in the far picture to the right is how we pack them in our clamshell, which go out to different CSAs, different grocery stores in the area. So being able to visually see the grape and making sure the fruit is quality is a really big factor when kind of marketing your fruit. In conclusion, as you can see in the picture there, those are some of our table grapes there. You can see some of the Blue X. You can see some of the irrigation hose. My biggest factor here is where I ran into a lot of trouble is where you see that machinery here with the bulldozer. I have this large wood line right here. And this is where a lot of my pressure comes from birds. So we've taken out select trees, we've cut back. We used to put up, like I said, the reflective tape, the cannon. But currently now I do not have any current photos. But this vineyard right here is now fully netted, and we had the best crop since we've planted that with no bird damage, which is gonna be your biggest factor. As long as you can get your plants to grow, you get water on them, you select fruit and not overcrop your plants, getting netting on your table grapes is going to be a very big factor if you have not planted yet, or if you are in the process of planting or have planted and not have nets. If you can say you don't have bird pressure at the moment, I kind of felt that way in the beginning. At this point, I have more bird pressure, and I feel the more fruit you have, the more desirable stuff you're planting, the birds are going to come, and they're going to kind of really do a number on your fruit. So I hope that kind of helps from a farmer's standpoint, from point A to point B to point C, of kind of getting your fruit out there. I would say the most important thing is, if you are growing table grapes, maybe an acre or 2 acres or half an acre, make sure you have a market before you really start planting, because table grapes tend to produce a lot of fruit. And if you are properly taking care of them and netting them and getting the most production without stressing plants out, you're going to have a lot of fruit to sell. And not having a specific market set to sell your fruit, you're going to have a lot of waste. And the nice thing about table grapes is you can pick them over a certain amount of weeks. So you're not fully stripping your vineyards. You're able to spot pick here and there each different row, and kind of selecting the more ripe fruit out and allowing the fruit that's not ripe yet to kind of have a little bit more space for itself to kind of get some nutrition, trying to get more sun and ripen. So I would say just make sure you guys have a market and a consistent market as that. So I thank you guys for having me here, and I'll open up for questions. And I believe.
Thank you so much. I really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
that. It was great. It was perfect. And I don't see any questions in the chat box. But if anybody has anything, they might even want to try to unmute themselves quickly and just ask Nick.
Yeah, I did. I put my email down at the bottom of the page here. I'm sure you guys can still see it. And I have my cell phone number at the bottom. I do a little bit of vineyard consulting if you guys do want to take my email or my number. And once the season does start coming upon us, I'm always available for questioning and even be able to visit your site. So if you want to take my email, which is njbozzo86@gmail.com. And my cell phone number is 845-674-3520.
Oh, I have one question, Nick, before you pop off.
Yep, I see it.
Okay, how long do you store the table grapes?
You know what? Table grapes are, as long as you have a nice cold storage, we tend to store them around 36 degrees. And like I said, if you're not really, it's really important not to overpile your grapes. It's really a good idea to allow them to have some air, not stack them too high on each other. And I would say anywhere from a month to maybe a month and a half, 2 months, depending on your cold storage and the quality of your fruit, as long as there's no, like I said, bird damage or rot in them. They tend to stay pretty good in cold storage. You will tend to get a little, the texture is going to change, as anything will in cold storage, as an apple or a berry would, but they do tend to stay quite a long time. So I would say anywhere from when you pick them to sell them, you do have about a month in storage. That's why it's always good to have a market where you're going to be consistently moving your fruit.
All right, great. Can you also comment, Hans is wondering about how FSMA might impact your business. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, geez. I never thought of it. I'm not too sure at the moment right now.
All right, and I think because this is a beginner's class, we'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Anybody else have any questions for Hans, or Anna, or for Nick? Well, hearing none, I'm gonna let you guys go. I will try to get the recordings of all 3 of these sessions put up, and I want to thank everybody for joining us, but especially I want to thank these speakers, Jim O'Connell, Liz Higgins, Anna Wallace from the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program, and George Hamilton from the University of New Hampshire, Hans Walter-Peterson from the Finger Lakes Grape Program with Cornell, and then especially our growers, Andy Farmer of the Northeastern Vine Supply and Nicolas Bozzo of Nostrano Vineyards. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.